Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do by the very people who should have known you best? Not by strangers, not by coworkers, by your own family, the people who watched you grow up, the people who shared your last name, the people who smiled at your face, while quietly rewriting the story of your life behind your back. Sometimes, the most painful betrayal isn't losing someone's love. It's watching people believe a lie because it's easier than asking for the truth. For 5 years, my family told everyone I had abandoned my grandfather. They said I was too busy, too selfish, too focused on my own life. According to them, I never visited him, never called, never cared. At his funeral, my own brother stood in front of relatives, friends, neighbors, and told them exactly that. He looked around the room with tears in his eyes and said, "Grandpa waited for Sarah every Sunday. She never came." The room fell silent. Then people started looking at me. Some shook their heads, others avoided eye contact. A few whispered to each other. I heard one woman quietly say, "That's heartbreaking." Another replied, "Children forget their parents and grandparents so easily these days." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell everyone they were wrong. But grief has a strange way of stealing your voice. I simply stood there, holding the white rose I had brought for Grandpa, wondering how my own family had managed to erase 5 years of love with a single sentence. They didn't know. Grandpa had already prepared for this. Months before he died, he had written down everything, every visit, every phone call, every birthday, every hospital appointment, every promise, every disappointment. By the time his hidden journal was opened, the people who called me heartless would wish they had never spoken at all. But before I tell you about Grandpa's journal, you need to understand how my family came to believe I was the granddaughter who never cared. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 33 years old. I teach fourth grade at a small elementary school just outside our hometown. It's not a glamorous job. I'll never become wealthy doing it. But every morning, 26 children run into my classroom excited to tell me about their lives. That has always felt like success to me. Unfortunately, my family had a different definition. My father, David Mitchell, spent his entire life building a successful accounting firm. He believed discipline solved everything. Work harder, earn more, complain less. Those were the rules he lived by. He wasn't a cruel man. He simply believed results mattered more than explanations. If something looked true, he rarely questioned it. My mother, Carol, loved keeping peace inside the family. Or at least, what looked like peace. She avoided conflict whenever possible. If believing one version of events prevented arguments, she accepted it without asking many questions. Sometimes, silence causes just as much damage as lies. Then there was my older brother, Brian, 3 years older than me, confident, funny, the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. People trusted him naturally, including our parents, especially our parents. Growing up, Brian rarely got blamed for anything. If we argued, I apologized. If something broke, I was questioned first. If Brian forgot a family birthday, everyone laughed. If I forgot, it became another example of how irresponsible I supposedly was. Little by little, those small moments created a story. Not the truth, just a story people repeated often enough that it eventually sounded real. The only person who never treated me that way was Grandpa Walter. He lived alone in a modest white farmhouse about 30 minutes outside town. After Grandma passed away, everyone promised to visit more often. Dad promised, Mom promised, Brian promised, my Aunt Rebecca promised. For the first few weeks, they did. Then life became busy. Business trips, vacations, meetings, dinner parties, one by one. The visits became less frequent. Eventually, most of them stopped altogether. I couldn't. Every Sunday afternoon, after church, I'd drive to Grandpa's house. Sometimes we worked in his vegetable garden. Sometimes we played chess. Sometimes we simply sat on the front porch drinking iced tea while watching the sunset. Grandpa always said, The best conversations happen when nobody is in a hurry. He was right. Those quiet afternoons became the highlight of my week. As Grandpa grew older, our routine slowly changed. The garden became harder for him to manage. His eyesight weakened. Walking became slower. So our visits became more practical. I'd grocery shop, organize medications, drive him to doctor's appointments, fix loose cabinet doors, cook enough meals for several days. He always tried to pay me. I always refused. "You've already spent your whole life taking care of this family," I'd tell him. "It's my turn now." He'd smile every time. One rainy Sunday, about 2 years before he passed away, I found him sitting alone in the living room. The power had gone out during a storm. The house was quiet. He was holding an old photograph of Grandma. "I miss her most on days like this," he admitted softly. I sat beside him. For nearly 3 hours, we talked. Not about illness, not about aging, about life, about mistakes, about forgiveness, about family. Before I left, he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, people usually remember the loud moments, but life is really built from quiet ones." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. Later, I realized he was talking about something much bigger. One Sunday, as I prepared to leave, Grandpa disappeared into his study. When he returned, he carried a worn leather notebook, dark brown, scuffed around the edges. Held together by a faded strap, he placed it on his desk. I smiled. "What's that?" "My journal." "You keep a journal?" He chuckled. "Every day for almost 40 years. I looked surprised. 40 years? He nodded proudly. "I started after your grandmother convinced me memories fade faster than we think." I reached toward it. He gently placed his hand over the cover. "Not yet." I laughed. "Secret?" He smiled. "Not secret. Just unfinished." I never asked about it again. I figured it contained personal thoughts, private memories, maybe stories about Grandma. I never imagined that one day, that journal would become the only witness capable of telling my side of the story. The lies began slowly, so slowly, I almost didn't notice. At first, Brian would casually tell relatives, "Sarah's always busy." Then, "She hardly has time to visit Grandpa anymore." Later, "I wish she'd come around more." Each sentence sounded harmless, concerned, even sympathetic. The problem was, none of it was true. And because I never defended myself, people assumed Brian was simply telling the truth. One evening, after leaving Grandpa's house, I stopped at a grocery store. Inside, I ran into Aunt Rebecca. She looked surprised. "Sarah, what are you doing out here?" "I just left Grandpa's." She frowned. "Really? Brian told us you hadn't visited in weeks." I laughed awkwardly. "No, I was just with him." She smiled politely. "Oh." Then she changed the subject. I thought nothing of it. I assumed it was just a misunderstanding. I had no idea. That misunderstanding was already spreading through our entire family. And before long, it would become the lie everyone believed. For a while, I believed the rumors would disappear on their own. After all, how could anyone honestly think I had abandoned Grandpa? I was there every Sunday, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. Surely Grandpa would tell them the truth. But he never did. Not because he agreed with the lies, because he hated conflict. Grandpa always believed actions eventually spoke louder than arguments. He just didn't realize some lies grow louder than silence. A few weeks after I ran into Aunt Rebecca, Mom invited everyone over for dinner. It was one of those monthly family gatherings where conversations revolved around work promotions, vacations, and investment opportunities. Brian had recently been named regional sales director. Dad couldn't stop talking about it. I'm proud of you, son. Brian smiled modestly. I've just been working hard. Then Mom looked at me. What about you, Sarah? How's school? It's good. My students just finished their reading projects. She nodded politely. That's nice. The conversation ended there. It always did. No one asked about my life for more than a few seconds. But somehow, there was always plenty of time to discuss Brian's achievements. Halfway through dinner, Dad casually asked, Have you seen your grandfather lately? I smiled. I was there Sunday. Brian looked up from his plate. Oh, I thought you skipped last weekend. I frowned. No. I was there from noon until almost 6. He shrugged. Must have remembered wrong. The conversation moved on. Everyone accepted his explanation. I didn't. It bothered me. Not because he forgot, because he sounded so certain. The next Sunday, I arrived at Grandpa's house carrying groceries. He was sitting on the porch, waiting. You look troubled. I smiled weakly. Do I? You've looked troubled since you got out of your car. That was Grandpa. He noticed everything. I told him about dinner, about Brian insisting I hadn't visited. Grandpa became unusually quiet. Finally, he asked, Has he said that before? I thought about it. Maybe. A few times. He slowly nodded. Then he stood. I'll be right back. He disappeared inside. A minute later, he returned carrying the same worn leather journal. This time, he opened it. For the first time, I saw the pages. Every date. Every entry, written neatly in blue ink. He flipped to the current month, then turned the journal toward me. Sunday, March 9th. Sarah visited today. Brought homemade soup. Repaired the porch light. Stayed 4 hours. Next page. Sunday, March 2nd. Sarah visited. We finished the crossword puzzle. She insisted on mowing the lawn. Another page. Sunday, February 23rd. Doctor's appointment. Sarah drove. Bought groceries afterward. Page after page, month after month, year after year. Every visit, every conversation, every little act of kindness. I looked up. You wrote all this? He smiled. I write every day. I laughed softly. You don't have to keep track. I'm not keeping score. He gently closed the journal. I'm preserving memories. Then his expression changed. And lately, I've begun preserving something else. What? The truth. Those words lingered in my mind. At the time, I didn't fully understand them. Over the next several months, life continued. School kept me busy. Grandpa's health slowly declined. He tired more easily. Walking required a cane. Sometimes, he forgot little things. Where he'd left his glasses, whether he'd taken his afternoon medication. But he never forgot my visits. Every Sunday. He greeted me with the same smile. I knew you'd come. One afternoon, while organizing old photo albums, I noticed several recent pictures on the coffee table. Most had been taken by visiting relatives. Brian standing beside Grandpa, Dad helping trim a tree, Mom bringing pie, Aunt Rebecca smiling in the garden. They looked like a close family. One photograph caught my attention. Brian had posted it online a few days earlier. The caption read, Sunday with Grandpa. Family always comes first. Thousands of likes, dozens of comments. You're such a wonderful grandson. Your grandfather is lucky to have you. Treasure every moment. I quietly looked at the date. Brian had stopped by. For 15 minutes. after I had already spent 5 hours there. He arrived just before sunset, asked Grandpa to pose for a picture, posted it online, then left. I hadn't minded, until I realized that single photo was becoming everyone's version of reality. Grandpa noticed me staring. "What is it?" I handed him the phone. He smiled sadly. "Your brother understands cameras." Then he looked at me. "You understand people." I laughed. "I think cameras are winning." He shook his head. "Only for a little while." As summer turned into autumn, Grandpa's heart condition worsened. His doctor recommended more frequent monitoring. I rearranged my teaching schedule whenever possible. Every Wednesday after school, I'd stop by, check his medication, prepare meals, help around the house. Sometimes we'd simply sit together. He loved telling stories about Grandma, about raising Dad, about mistakes he'd made. He never pretended he'd been perfect. "I spent too many years working. I almost missed watching your father grow up." He looked at me. "Don't repeat my mistake." One chilly October afternoon, Grandpa surprised me. "I want you to have something." He handed me a small brass key. "What does it open?" "My old desk." I smiled. "Why?" "If anything ever happens to me, I'd like you to clean out my study." I looked uncomfortable. "Grandpa, let's not talk like that." He smiled gently. "We don't choose when life ends. But we can choose to leave things in order." I slipped the key into my purse, never imagining how important it would become. The holidays arrived. As always, the whole family gathered for Christmas dinner. Brian arrived carrying expensive gifts, designer watches for Dad, jewelry for Mom, luxury wine for relatives. Everyone admired his generosity. I brought homemade photo albums, one for Grandpa, filled with pictures from our Sunday afternoons together, gardening, chess, fishing, cooking, quiet moments. He smiled wider than I'd seen in months. "This," he whispered, "is my favorite gift." Brian looked over. "Oh, I didn't know you two spent that much time together." I laughed. "You've seen me here almost every Sunday." He blinked, then smiled. "I guess I just forgot." Again. Forgot. Always forgot. Only, he never forgot the stories he told everyone else. Late that evening, as I helped Grandpa into his favorite chair, he reached for my hand. "Sarah, if people misunderstand you, don't waste your life chasing their approval. They'll eventually meet the truth." I smiled. "You always make it sound so simple." He squeezed my hand. "No, it'll be painful. But truth is patient. It never needs to shout." 3 months later, everything changed. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was teaching math when the principal knocked softly on my classroom door. "Sarah, I need to speak with you." The moment I saw her face, I knew. My knees weakened. Grandpa was gone. The funeral took place 4 days later. The church overflowed with people. Former students, neighbors, friends, veterans, community members. Everyone had come to honor Grandpa Walter Mitchell. I stood beside his casket, holding the white rose he'd always said reminded him of Grandma. I could barely breathe. Then, Brian stepped forward to give the family tribute. I thought he was going to share memories. Instead, he looked directly at the crowd and quietly said, "Grandpa had one regret during his final years. He kept hoping Sarah would visit him again." My heart stopped. The room turned toward me, and before I could speak, Brian continued. The church became impossibly quiet. Dozens of faces turned toward me. Some looked confused. Others looked disappointed. A few shook their heads with sympathy. Brian lowered his voice, the kind of voice people use when they want to sound compassionate. "I know life gets busy. I know we all have responsibilities, but Grandpa never stopped asking about Sarah. He waited every Sunday. He kept hoping she'd come through that front door. Brian paused, then sighed. Unfortunately, she rarely did. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "How sad." Another quietly replied, "He deserved better." Every word landed like a stone in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not because strangers believed him, because my own brother was saying it while standing beside Grandpa's casket. I wanted to interrupt, to tell everyone he was lying, to explain that I'd been there almost every week for 5 years. But I looked toward my parents. Dad sat with his eyes lowered. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He simply looked disappointed. Mom quietly wiped away tears, not because she doubted Brian, because she believed him. That realization hurt more than anything else. My own parents had accepted a lie without ever asking me a single question. Brian finished speaking. I hope this reminds all of us. Never wait too long to tell people you love them. The congregation nodded. People even applauded softly. I stood frozen, wondering how a complete lie had just become the funeral's biggest lesson. After the service, relatives gathered outside the church. Normally, funerals are filled with comforting words. Not that day. People approached me carefully, almost awkwardly. One elderly neighbor patted my shoulder. "I'm sorry." I smiled weakly. "So am I." She sighed. "I visited your grandfather a few months ago. He spoke about family. I wish you'd had more time with him." I looked at her. "I had plenty of time." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I saw him every week." Confusion crossed her face. "But Brian said—" She stopped speaking. For a brief second, I saw doubt. Then Aunt Rebecca walked over. "There you are." She linked arms with the woman. "Brian took wonderful care of Dad. He was always checking on him." The conversation ended, just like that. Another opportunity lost. As people slowly left, I remained beside Grandpa's grave. Everyone else had gone back to the reception hall. Only I stayed behind. The spring wind moved gently through the cemetery. I knelt beside the fresh flowers. "I'm sorry. I couldn't protect your memory." A familiar voice answered behind me. "You don't have to." I turned. It was Jonathan Hayes, Grandpa's attorney. But calling him an attorney hardly described him. He had been Grandpa's closest friend for nearly 30 years. They played chess every Thursday evening, worked on community projects together, shared countless fishing trips. Jonathan was the only person Grandpa trusted almost as much as Grandma. He stood quietly beside me, holding his hat in one hand. "I've been looking for you." I stood. "Is something wrong?" He smiled gently. "No. In fact, I think something is finally about to be made right." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a small envelope, not sealed, just folded. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this." I looked at the handwriting. It was unmistakably Grandpa's. Across the front, only 3 words. "For Sarah. Only." I swallowed. "When did he write this?" "A little over 6 months ago." I looked at Jonathan. "Should I open it?" He shook his head. "Not yet." I smiled through tears. "That sounds exactly like him." Jonathan laughed softly. "Yes." He was very specific. He said, "Give this to Sarah after the funeral. But tell her to wait." "Wait for what?" Jonathan looked toward the cemetery. "For the truth." Those words made no sense. Not yet. The family reception was held at Grandpa's farmhouse. Neighbors filled the kitchen. Friends shared stories. Children played outside beneath the old oak tree. Everything felt strangely normal, except for the tension surrounding me. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. People smiled politely, then looked away. I knew what they were thinking. Poor Grandpa. His granddaughter abandoned him. I carried that weight silently, because arguing during a funeral would have dishonored the man I loved. Late that afternoon, most guests had left. Only family remained. Dad stood in Grandpa's workshop, looking through old tools. "I can't believe he's gone." His voice sounded small, older somehow. I walked over. "Dad," he interrupted. "You know, I wish you'd spent more time with him." I stared at him. "I did." He sighed heavily. "Brian wouldn't lie about something like that." There it was. No anger, no accusation, just certainty. A certainty built entirely on someone else's words. I quietly asked, "Did you ever ask Grandpa?" Dad frowned. "What?" "If I wasn't visiting, did you ever ask him?" Silence. Dad looked away. "I didn't think I needed to." That answer stayed with me long after he walked out of the room. As evening approached, Jonathan gathered everyone inside the living room. There weren't many of us left. Dad, Mom, Brian, Aunt Rebecca, my cousin Melissa, and me. Jonathan placed a leather folder on the coffee table. "As Walter requested, we'll review his estate." Brian leaned back confidently. "It shouldn't take long." Jonathan smiled politely. "No, it won't." He opened the folder. Most financial matters were settled years ago. Dad looked surprised. "They were?" "Yes." Walter believed families fought too often over money. So he arranged almost everything before his passing. Brian looked slightly disappointed. I noticed. Only for a second. But I noticed. Jonathan continued. "The house will be sold. The proceeds will be donated to local literacy programs." I smiled. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. Books had always been his greatest passion. "The remaining investments," he continued, "will fund scholarships for students pursuing careers in education." I felt tears fill my eyes. Teaching had meant everything to Grandpa. He often said, "One great teacher changes hundreds of lives." Brian shifted uncomfortably. I suspected he'd expected something different, perhaps a larger inheritance. Instead, Grandpa was investing in strangers' futures. Then Jonathan closed the folder. "I have one final instruction." The room became quiet. He looked directly at me. "Sarah." I nodded. "Walter left you one personal responsibility." My heart began racing. "What is it?" Jonathan reached into his pocket and placed an old brass key on the table. I recognized it immediately. "My desk," he smiled. "Yes. Your grandfather instructed that only you may open it." Brian frowned. "What's inside?" Jonathan shrugged. "I honestly don't know." But Walter insisted. He wanted the entire family present when it was opened. We walked together toward Grandpa's study, a room filled with bookshelves, maps, old photographs, and the large oak desk where he'd spent countless evenings writing. My hands trembled as I inserted the brass key. The lock clicked. Slowly, I pulled open the top drawer. Inside, there were only 3 things: a fountain pen, a sealed envelope, and the worn brown leather journal. The same journal Grandpa had refused to show me. Jonathan carefully picked it up. He turned to the first page, then quietly said something that made every person in the room stop breathing. "Walter instructed me to read this aloud. From the very beginning." No one spoke. The old study suddenly felt much smaller. Brian folded his arms. Dad stood beside the bookshelf. Mom quietly held a tissue in her hands. Jonathan rested Grandpa's worn leather journal on the desk. He looked around the room before speaking. "Walter left very clear instructions. He said this journal wasn't meant to settle arguments. It was meant to preserve the truth. Then Jonathan opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa's. Neat, steady, patient. Jonathan began reading. January 8th. Sarah visited after church today. She brought chicken soup because she said the weather was getting colder. She stayed long after lunch and refused to let me wash the dishes. I told her she worries too much. She smiled and said that's what granddaughters are for. The room remained silent. Jonathan turned another page. January 15th. Brian stopped by. He stayed 12 minutes. Asked if I needed anything. Took a photograph together before leaving for a golf game. No one reacted. Not yet. Jonathan continued. January 22nd. Sarah drove me to my cardiology appointment. The waiting room was crowded. She never once complained. On the drive home, we stopped for peach pie. Best afternoon I've had in weeks. Mom slowly lowered her eyes. Another page. February 5th. Snow today. I told Sarah not to drive. She came anyway. Shoveled my driveway before I even woke up. She nearly froze doing it. She still laughed the entire morning. Dad shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan looked at Brian. Not accusingly. Simply waiting. Brian stared at the floor. The pages continued. Week after week. Month after month. There wasn't a single gap. Every Sunday. Every hospital visit. Every grocery trip. Every birthday. Every quiet afternoon. Sarah. 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 Again. And again. And again. Then, Jonathan stopped on one particular entry. He took a slower breath before reading. April 18th. Today, Brian called. He apologized for missing my birthday. Said work had been overwhelming. I understand. Life becomes busy. I only wish he wouldn't tell everyone he was here. The silence became heavier. Brian looked up. What? Jonathan calmly continued. Several neighbors thanked him today for being such a devoted grandson. They described visits that never happened. I didn't correct them. Not because Brian deserved the praise. Because I hoped one day he would become the grandson everyone believed he already was. Brian swallowed hard. Jonathan turned another page. June 11th. Rebecca visited today. She asked whether Sarah still comes. I told her. Every Sunday. She seemed surprised. She said Brian told the family Sarah had become too busy. Interesting how easily one sentence becomes accepted as truth. Aunt Rebecca's face turned pale. She couldn't finish. Jonathan kept reading. August 3rd. David hasn't asked me once whether Sarah visits. Not because he doesn't care. Because he trusts Brian. Sometimes trust without verification becomes unfair to everyone involved. Dad slowly sat down. He looked as though someone had taken all the strength from his body. Jonathan continued. September 21st. Carol worries constantly about keeping everyone happy. In doing so, she rarely asks difficult questions. Silence often protects the loudest voice. Mom covered her face. Tears slipped between her fingers. Nobody interrupted anymore. There was nothing left to deny. Grandpa had quietly documented everything. Not with anger, not with bitterness, simply with honesty. Jonathan closed the journal for a moment. There are over 300 entries. Almost every day. I've only read a few. Brian finally spoke. This doesn't prove anything. Everyone turned toward him. He stood quickly. A journal is it's just one person's opinion. For the first time, Jonathan's expression hardened. No. He quietly reached inside the desk drawer. There was something else. He removed a small envelope. Inside were neatly organized receipts, gas station receipts, pharmacy receipts, grocery receipts, medical appointment cards, every single one dated Many carried my signature, others listed Grandpa's appointment times, some even included handwritten notes. Sarah picked up prescription, paid by granddaughter. Next appointment Wednesday. Jonathan spread them across the desk. Walter believed memories fade, so he kept records. Brian didn't say another word. Dad picked up one receipt, then another. Finally, he found a hospital parking ticket. The date caught his attention. That had been the day Grandpa underwent a heart procedure. Dad looked at me. I thought Brian was with him. I quietly answered. No. I took the day off from school. I sat beside him for 9 hours. Dad stared at the parking ticket. His hands began trembling. I never knew. I looked at him gently. You never asked. Those 4 words echoed through the room. Mom suddenly burst into tears. Oh my God. She looked at me. Sarah. I believed. She couldn't finish. The shame was too heavy. Jonathan opened the journal again. I believe Walter wanted one more entry read today. He turned near the back. The ink looked newer, written only weeks before Grandpa passed away. Jonathan read slowly. I've noticed something troubling. Sarah never defends herself. When people praise Brian for visiting, she simply smiles. When relatives suggest she's too busy, she changes the subject. She protects everyone's peace, even when it costs her own reputation. My eyes filled with tears. That was exactly what I had done. For years. Grandpa continued. People often mistake silence for guilt. Sometimes. Silence is simply love refusing to become another argument. Nobody looked at me anymore. They looked at the journal, as if hearing Grandpa speak one final time. Then Jonathan reached the final pages. He smiled softly. Walter left one instruction beside this entry. He held up a sealed envelope. Across the front, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, were 7 words. Read this only after they know the truth. Jonathan looked around the room. I believe we've reached that moment. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to stop. He carefully broke the seal, folded the letter open, looked at the first line, then slowly raised his eyes. This, he whispered, changes everything. Jonathan unfolded the letter with both hands. The paper was slightly yellow. The edges had softened with time. For a long moment, he didn't speak. His eyes slowly moved across Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Then he looked at all of us. Walter specifically requested that no one interrupt while this letter is being read. He took a slow breath and began. To my family, if Jonathan is reading this letter, then I have already gone home. Please don't spend today arguing over who was right and who was wrong. Spend it asking yourselves how the truth became so easy to ignore. The room fell completely silent. For many years, I watched each of you become busier. That isn't unusual. Life changes. Children grow up. Careers demand more time. Families become complicated. I never expected perfection. I only hoped for honesty. Jonathan turned the page. I noticed something that saddened me more than growing old. People slowly stopped believing what they saw. Instead, they believed whoever spoke with the most confidence. That frightened me. Dad lowered his head. Brian, you are intelligent. You are charming. You know how to make people believe you. That can become either your greatest strength or your greatest weakness. Brian stared at the floor. His face had lost all color. I don't believe you began lying because you hated your sister. I believe you enjoyed being admired. One small exaggeration became another. Eventually, Even you forgot where the truth ended and the performance began. Brian closed his eyes. His shoulders slowly dropped. Jonathan continued reading. Carol, you always wanted peace. But peace without truth isn't peace. It's simply quiet. Real families don't become stronger by avoiding uncomfortable conversations. They become stronger by having them. Mom quietly cried into her hands. David, you've always trusted people who sound certain. That quality helped you build a successful business. Unfortunately, families require more listening than management. Sometimes the quietest person carries the greatest burden. Dad wiped away tears. It was the first time in years I had ever seen my father cry. Jonathan looked toward me before continuing. His voice softened. Sarah, if you're hearing this, then I wasn't able to tell you these words myself. So let me say them now. You never failed me. The tears I had been holding back finally escaped. You gave me something no amount of money could ever buy. Your time, your patience, your laughter, your ordinary Sundays. You made an old man feel remembered. Please never believe anyone who tells you those moments were small. They were my greatest treasure. I pressed my hand over my mouth. Grandpa had noticed everything, even the moments I believed no one else had seen. Jonathan continued. Do you remember the rainy afternoon when the electricity went out? A faint smile appeared through my tears. I remembered. Perfectly. You stayed with me until nearly midnight because you knew I didn't want to be alone. You missed work the next morning. You never mentioned the sacrifice. Love usually looks exactly like that. Quiet. Unnoticed. Consistent. The room remained perfectly still. No one dared interrupt Grandpa's final words. Jonathan carefully turned another page. My greatest regret isn't that I grew old. It's that Sarah spent years carrying accusations she never deserved. I watched relatives thank Brian for visits he didn't make. I watched neighbors praise people who barely knew my daily life. Meanwhile, the granddaughter who truly cared simply smiled and let others receive the credit. That broke my heart. I lowered my eyes. I had never wanted recognition. I only wanted Grandpa to know he wasn't alone. Jonathan paused. There is one final section. He looked directly at Brian. Brian, if you are listening, I hope today becomes the beginning of your honesty. Not because your sister deserves an apology, although she certainly does, because you deserve the freedom that only truth can bring. Lies eventually imprison the person who tells them. I've watched yours grow heavier every year. Please, set them down. The letter ended. No one moved. Even the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than usual. Tick, tick, tick. Finally. Brian stood. He looked at Jonathan, then at Dad, then at me. His voice barely rose above a whisper. He stopped. Tried again. I don't know when it started. Nobody interrupted. It wasn't supposed to become this. He rubbed his forehead. The first time, I only told Aunt Rebecca that Sarah had probably been busy. I honestly didn't know she'd been there that morning. Then people started thanking me for visiting Grandpa. They called me the devoted grandson. They told Dad how proud he should be. I liked hearing it. He swallowed hard. So I stopped correcting them. His voice cracked. After that, it just became easier to keep pretending. Dad stared at him in disbelief. You let us believe your own sister abandoned her grandfather? Brian nodded slowly. Tears rolled down his face. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone. Then he looked at me. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. Aunt Rebecca suddenly began crying. I repeated those stories. She looked at me with shame. I never once asked you. Mom reached for my hand. I didn't either. Her voice trembled. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I chose the easiest explanation instead of trusting my own daughter. Dad couldn't even look at me. I failed you. 3 simple words. Words I had waited years to hear. I looked around Grandpa's study, at the journal, at the photographs, at the old desk, and I realized something. Grandpa hadn't written those pages to punish anyone. He wrote them because he knew memories could be manipulated, but written truth could not. Jonathan carefully closed the journal. I believe Walter left one final instruction. He reached beneath the last page. There was another folded note, smaller this time. Only one sentence was written across it. Jonathan smiled through tears. I think this was meant for all of us. He unfolded it, read the words silently, then looked up. I've practiced law for 38 years. I've read thousands of wills, but I've never read anything like this. He slowly began reading Grandpa's final message, and every person in the room realized this wasn't the end of Grandpa's legacy. It was the beginning of a completely different family. No one spoke. Grandpa's study, once filled with quiet conversations and laughter, now echoed with nothing but the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Tick, tick, tick. Every second seemed to remind us that time could never be recovered. You could replace money, you could rebuild a house, you could even repair a broken business, but you could never go back and spend one more Sunday with someone who was gone forever. Jonathan looked down at the small, folded note Grandpa had left beneath the journal. I believe, he said softly, this is the last thing Walter wanted his family to hear. He unfolded it with extraordinary care. The paper was much newer than the journal pages. The handwriting, however, was unmistakably Grandpa's. Neat, steady, patient. Jonathan smiled sadly. Then he began reading. Grandpa's final message. If you've reached this page, then my journal has already done its job. The truth has been spoken. Now comes the harder part. Deciding what to do with it. Jonathan paused only long enough for the words to settle. Then he continued. Truth isn't a weapon. It's a mirror. It shows us who we really are. Some people will look away. Others will finally recognize themselves. My hope is that everyone in this room chooses the second path. The room remained completely silent. No one wanted the letter to end. Sarah, you've spent years carrying accusations that never belonged to you. Please don't spend the rest of your life carrying resentment instead. Bitterness feels like justice for a little while. Eventually, it only becomes another prison. I closed my eyes. Grandpa knew me better than anyone. He knew that even after everything, I didn't hate my family. I was simply exhausted. Exhausted from defending myself in my own mind. Exhausted from wondering why nobody had ever asked for my side of the story. Jonathan continued. Brian, one day you'll understand that admiration earned through lies disappears the moment the truth arrives. Respect earned through honesty lasts much longer. I hope you spend the rest of your life earning the second. Brian quietly covered his face. His shoulders shook. For the first time since childhood, I wasn't looking at the confident older brother everyone admired. I was looking at a broken man finally forced to meet the consequences of his own choices. David, a father doesn't only provide for his children, he protects them. Even from unfair judgments made inside his own home. I know you love Sarah. Now, please let her feel it. Dad slowly lowered himself into Grandpa's old chair. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. His voice trembled. I thought I was a good father. Jonathan gently closed the letter for a moment. No parent gets everything right. What matters now is what you do next. Carol, never mistake avoiding conflict for protecting your family. Sometimes, the conversation you fear the most becomes the one that saves everyone. Mom cried openly. I should have asked her. She looked directly at me. One conversation. That's all it would have taken. I nodded. Yes, it would have. Jonathan reached the final paragraph. Family isn't built by blood. Family is built by showing up, week after week, year after year, especially when no one else notices. Sarah, thank you for showing up. You gave an old man the greatest gift anyone ever could. You made sure he never felt forgotten. That is a legacy no inheritance could ever equal. I leave this journal to you, not as proof, but as a reminder. The truth never needs to chase people. Eventually, they find it. Jonathan quietly folded the letter. The room remained silent for nearly a full minute. No one knew what to say. Finally, Brian stood, slowly, carefully, as though every movement carried the weight of years. He walked across the room, stopped only a few feet away from me. I don't deserve your forgiveness. His voice cracked. I stole something from you. I looked at him quietly. My reputation. My relationship with Mom and Dad. My memories with Grandpa. He nodded. And I can never give those years back. No, you can't. Another long silence. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. I brought something. He placed his phone on Grandpa's desk. I've already written a post. I looked at the screen. It was addressed to every friend, relative, and neighbor who had followed him online. He looked at Jonathan. I was going to delete it. But Grandpa would have wanted me to tell the truth publicly. Jonathan simply nodded. Brian pressed one button. The message went live. It read, For years I accepted praise I didn't deserve. I allowed people to believe my sister abandoned Grandpa. She didn't. She visited him every week. She cared for him when the rest of us were too busy. Everything people believed about her was wrong. I'm deeply sorry to Sarah, and to everyone I misled. He set the phone back down. I can't erase what I did. But I can stop the lie from living another day. Over the following weeks, the truth spread far more quickly than I expected. Relatives began calling. Some apologized through tears. Others admitted they had believed Brian without ever asking questions. Neighbors stopped me at the grocery store. I'm so sorry. We had no idea. Former friends sent handwritten letters. One even admitted, I judged you without knowing you. For years I had imagined those conversations. Yet when they finally happened, they didn't feel like victory. They felt like peace. There is a difference. Victory defeats someone else. Peace frees you. Several months later, the local library invited me to speak during their annual community reading event. Jonathan attended. So did my parents. Even Brian came. At the front of the room, displayed inside a glass case, rested Grandpa's leather journal, exactly as he had requested, not hidden away in a drawer, not locked inside a safe, but preserved where future generations could learn from it. Beside the journal sat a small bronze plaque. It read, Dedicated to Walter Mitchell, who believed that kindness deserves to be remembered and that truth is the greatest inheritance we leave behind. Children walked past it without fully understanding. Adults often stopped, read the inscription, then quietly reflected. Grandpa was still teaching people, even after he was gone. One afternoon, almost a year later, Dad asked if we could have lunch together, just the two of us. We met at the same small diner Grandpa had loved. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Dad looked at me. I've replayed those years in my mind 1,000 times. So have I. He nodded. I keep asking myself one question. What question? Why didn't I notice? I smiled sadly. You trusted the loudest voice. He lowered his eyes. I won't make that mistake again. Then he reached across the table. Not with money, not with gifts, simply with his hand. I can't change your childhood. I can't change those years. But if you'll let me, I'd like to know my daughter again. For the first time in a very long time, I reached back and took his hand. Healing doesn't happen because the past disappears. It happens because someone finally chooses a different future. Brian changed too. Not overnight. Real change never happens that way. He started volunteering at the senior center where Grandpa used to read to children. He stopped posting every good deed online. He visited elderly residents who had no family. Sometimes he'd spend hours simply listening. One afternoon, I asked him why. He smiled quietly. I spent years pretending to be the grandson Grandpa deserved. He looked toward the garden outside. I'm trying to become him now. Grandpa would have liked that answer. As for me, life became wonderfully ordinary again. I still taught fourth grade. I still encouraged children to fall in love with books. Every year, on Grandpa's birthday, my students and I planted flowers outside the school library. Before we began, I always shared one lesson with them. Not about betrayal, not about lies, but about kindness. I would tell them, people may forget your achievements. They may misunderstand your intentions. They may even believe stories that aren't true. But never stop showing up for the people you love. Because kindness is never wasted. Someone always remembers. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I'd open Grandpa's journal to a random page, not to prove anyone wrong. I no longer needed proof. I opened it because every page reminded me of something far more important. Love is rarely loud. It doesn't always receive applause. It isn't measured by photographs, or social media posts, or public speeches at funerals. Real love is measured in ordinary Sundays, in grocery bags carried without being asked, in hospital waiting rooms, in fixing a porch light, in sitting beside someone during a thunderstorm because they're afraid to be alone. Those quiet moments become the chapters that truly define a life. Grandpa understood that long before the rest of us did, and because he chose to write them down, the truth found us, exactly when we needed it most.